Magnus Carlsen plays the Milner Barry Gambit against the French defense in this, the last round of Title Tuesday. His opponent is an IM named Renato Terry, who just had an incredibly strong tournament that he was able to be paired with Magnus in the final round. Let's jump right in and see. Magnus has white, IM Terry has black. Magnus begins with e4, black plays e6, d4, d5, and we have the French defense on the board. There are many different moves here for white, but Magnus plays the clearest move, which is e5. This is the advanced variation of the French defense. White says, you're going to give me space? Well, then I'm going to take the space. And he already has a space advantage in the center of the board. Black plays c5, attacking the base of the pawn chain. That's basically the idea in this structure. Black allows white to have a nice strong pawn chain, but then attacks it and tries to disintegrate the pawn structure. c3 to protect the base. Queen to b6, attacking d4 even further. Now, it's strange for the queen to be the first piece to be developed, usually. But the idea is he wants to attack d4 and maybe allow for this bishop d7, bishop b5 idea. Because the bishop at c8 is a perpetual problem for black in the French defense. You can see how it's blocked in by their central pawns. So a lot of times black will delay the development of the queen's knight and try to play bishop d7, b5 to trade off the bad bishop. And so that is what black might be aiming at here. Knight to f3, very natural move, and bishop to d7. And it looks like he is aiming, potentially, at trading off that bishop on b5. Magnus plays bishop to d3, the most aggressive posting of the bishop. The only downside is that it interferes with the queen's ability to defend d4, and sometimes black will try to exploit that. In this case, IM Terry immediately takes on d4. Now here, the main move might be cd4 and then bishop to b5, and black would exchange the bad bishop. White's still okay here, by the way, but it's something of a strategic victory for black to get that bishop off the board at least. But Magnus, instead of going in that line, decides to castle, to play the Milner Barry Gambit. And the idea is basically he's just gambiting a central pawn in the hopes of getting play against black's king, which he hopes he can keep in the center of the board. And if white takes on c3 after knight c3, white is very happy in this position. White has a very nice attacking formation, even though they are down a pawn. So instead of taking there, black plays knight to c6, just adds to the defense of this pawn and puts more pressure on e5. And here Magnus plays rook to e1. Now, the old way of playing the Milner Barry Gambit would be to take on a d4. Then when black takes on d4 with the knight, white responds by taking on d4, queen takes d4, and knight to c3. And if, say, queen to e5, then rook to e1, queen to b8, knight to d5, taking advantage of this pin along the e file. As it turns out, with best play, black is actually probably is okay here, but it's very dangerous. I mean, who would want to play that position? If knight to e7, then knight to b5 is a strong idea. Hitting the queen, threatening to hop in to d6 with check. So after bishop b5, obviously the queen would be lost. So that would be a serious threat. And a6, keeping the knight at bay at b5 would be black's best move. And essentially what happened is players of the black pieces realized if they played bishop to d7 to avoid bishop b5 traps, then played a6 to keep the knight out of b5, black would have a good position, and they usually do. So white came up with a new way of playing the Milner Barry Gambit, and we see that in this game. He plays rook to e1, perfectly happy for black to take on c3. Black plays knight g to e7. He wants this knight on b1 to go to d2 so he can take on c3 without the knight comfortably capturing it on c3. So he's waiting for that knight to commit itself before he takes on c3. h4, gaining space on the king side, a normal idea in these advanced structures. And a6. Basically, black is threatening to take on c3, and after knight c3, play knight to d4, and transpose to the types of positions we saw in that variation earlier, the way the game used to be played. So after h5, h6, Magnus says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and play knight b to d2 and not allow that normal position to arise. dc3, bc3. And here, of course, black is up a pawn. This c3 pawn is very functional. It's a weak pawn. It's isolated and weak, but it keeps this knight on c6 in check, but it can also go to c4 and attack black's center a little bit later. And after queen to c7, that's exactly what Magnus does. He plays c4, trying to open up lines against black's king in the middle of the board as quickly as he can. Black plays knight to b4, hitting this very strong light-squared bishop, and also perhaps he can recapture on d5 with the knight if he needs to. The bishop goes to f1, pawn takes c4, and now knight to c4. So Magnus has a very serious threat, obviously, of knight to d6 check, and then you just take on f7 and win the rook. So to prevent that, black plays the knight on e7 to d5, so this bishop at f8 can cover the d6 square if the knight lands on it. Bishop to b2 covers this square so the knight can't jump there, puts the bishop on a long diagonal, even though it's blocked, and allows the rook to come to c1 opposite black's queen. Bishop to c5, and now knight to d6 check. Magnus is willing to allow black to take the knight at the cost of a pawn, but give up that very valuable dark squared bishop. If bishop takes d6, ed6, queen d6, a3, knight c6, bishop g7, you get that pawn back, and black's king would be stuck in the middle of the board, and he definitely does not want that. So instead, he plays the king to f8. He's able to keep his dark squared bishop, but now the king can't castle, and the rook at h8 is going to have a very hard time getting into the game. Bishop to d4 is what the computer's like here, basically forcing black to make a decision with his bishop at c5. Magnus plays queen to d2. Here, the computer's come up with a very interesting concept for black. Knight to c2, forking the rooks. And if queen takes knight, then bishop can take the knight. And because the queens are opposite each other and the bishop at d6 defends the queen, black is doing fine. But instead, black plays queen to b6, rook a to b1, putting the rook at opposite the queen, queen to a7, and now bishop to d4. And here there's a pin on this bishop against the queen, so that forces the bishop off. And that makes this knight on d6 extremely hard to get rid of. A very powerful move, getting rid of that dark squared bishop for Magnus. Bishop d4, knight d4, queen c5, a3, kicking that knight back. The knight goes to c6, but now, boom, rook takes b7. And we see that the Milner Barry Gambit is showing itself to be a very strong opening in this game. Of course, most openings are strong in the hands of Magnus Carlsen, But in this case, it's definitely working well. Black could take on d4 with the queen, but after queen d4, knight d4, rook d7, white is doing very well with threats against the f7 pawn. So instead, black defends the bishop with rook to d8, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and rook to c1, hitting the queen, sort of skewering it to this bishop on c6. There's really nowhere the queen can move and maintain a defense of that bishop. So he takes the knight on d6 with the queen, with the intention of taking the rook on b7 as a follow-up, ed6, bishop takes b7, and black does have a knight and a rook in exchange for the queen, almost equal material. The problem is his positional negatives are still on the board. Essentially, this king is more vulnerable, and the rook at h8 is still locked out of the play. The queen goes to b2 to hit the bishop on b7, bishop a8. Bishop takes a6, a little more material is gained. King to g8. Black has to find a way to get this rook activated, so he's going to go to king h7, but that takes time, very valuable time. Rook to c8. Magnus is up material. He wants to trade off pieces. Rook takes c8, bishop c8, king to h7, and of course now, at least temporarily, the rook is threatening the bishop on c8. So Magnus plays d7, which defends that bishop, and is also one square away from queening. Knight to f6, aims at the pawn. Queen to c2 check. Bishop to e4 blocks the check. And queen to c7. And in this position, Magnus Carlsen won on the clock, but he is also completely winning on the board, threatening immediately to queen and win the rook. Black could play knight to d5 and hit white's queen, but after queen to a5, he stays in contact with the queening square, and it's very clear that Magnus is going to win. So I hope you enjoyed this game from Magnus Carlsen, and pretty effective gambit against the French. If you haven't played it before, give it a try. I think you might like it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.